Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Thursday, everybody. It's a big episode today, so let's just dive in. General Secretary Xi Jinping has left France and Serbia and has arrived in Hungary, part of his first trip to Europe in 5 years. There is a lot to cover on this trip, so for today we will cover the French leg, and tomorrow we will cover the Hungary and Serbia leg. Though it was all smiles in France, this was the most difficult leg of Xi's Europe trip, with Serbia and Hungary being much friendlier stops. Indeed, Gideon Rachman, Chief Foreign Affairs columnist for the UK-based Financial Times, argues this week that Xi's decision to visit Serbia and Hungary, quote, will make it difficult to convince most other Europeans that he comes in friendship. Serbia sits outside both the EU and NATO, while Hungary has undermined both organizations from within. Both countries are friendly to Russia. The fact that Xi will return home to receive Vladimir Putin in Beijing shortly afterwards will deepen European apprehension about China's real intentions. End quote. Xi's goals for the French leg were threefold. 1. Make the focus of EU-China relations win-win economic engagement and push back against protectionist trends and accusations of overcapacity. 2. Try to convince Europeans that China isn't supporting Moscow's war in Ukraine. And 3. Prevent the Europeans becoming too aligned with the US in their China policy. State media pushed the third goal in the lead-up to the trip especially. State-run Global Times, for example, quoted Sun Keqian, a research fellow at the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, as expressing, quote, US interference remains, but Europe has kept a certain degree of autonomy and is able to cooperate with China, especially the French leadership, which has always had a strong sense of strategic autonomy in a pragmatic manner, end quote, adding, quote, Europeans will also have the opportunity to think about how to handle its relations with China, whether to follow the US to engage in confrontation and lose their own interests, or to jointly develop mutual benefits and get win-win results, end quote. European viewers can decide for themselves whether they think these statements are convincing, accurate, and sincere. Though we do note that Chinese commentators have highlighted remarks that Macron made last year after visiting China that Europe should forge its own strategic independence and become a third pole in geopolitics, autonomous of Beijing and Washington. Wang Wen, Executive Dean of the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China in Beijing and the US-China Humanities Exchange Research Center, speaking to state-run Guancha, writes this week that, quote, the US strategy of pulling Europe to contain China will not succeed. More and more Europeans are becoming aware that after losing Russia, they cannot afford to lose China, end quote. Once again, it appears that China's elite policymakers are failing to appreciate that while there is indeed some US pressure in areas like semiconductor exports, for example, the main concerns that Europeans have, namely trade and Ukraine, are very much local indigenous concerns. On Monday, Xi addressed the closing ceremony of the China-France Business Council meeting, where he announced that China had decided to extend the visa-free policy for short-term visits to China by citizens of 12 countries, including France, until the end of 2025, adding that China will expand the opening up of telecommunications, medical and other service industries, and further open up its market to create more opportunities for companies from all over the world, including France and Europe. As we anticipated, the French are looking for Chinese investment too, with the French finance minister stating the same day, quote, France welcomes all industrial projects. BYD and the Chinese auto industry are very welcome in France, end quote. French and Chinese companies concluded some agreements on Monday ranging from energy, finance and transport on the sidelines of Xi's visit, but most were agreements to cooperate or renewed commitments to work together, and there were no significant deals. Xi Jinping had meetings with both Macron and von der Leyen. We don't know how these went in private. In the public statement, the PRC Foreign Ministry expressed, quote, President Xi pointed out that the Chinese civilization is the only one that has continued uninterrupted for more than 5,000 years. That is why the Chinese people have a strong commitment to their country, especially when it comes to national unification, which they value and cherish. Although the Chinese and French civilizations, one in the east, the other in the west, have different values and social systems, both are committed to inter-civilization exchanges and mutual learning. Given the uncertainties in the current international situation, it is vital that Europe maintains strategic autonomy, solidarity, and unity." End quote. It was reported that Xi said he would welcome more high-level talks on trade frictions, but also denied that there was a Chinese overcapacity problem, casting doubts on how much progress could eventually be achieved, as this is a major concern for Europeans. Paris-based France 24 writes that advisors to the French president described the Pyrenees trip as breaking with protocol for a chance for a one-on-one chat with Xi without scores of aides. The same outlet, quoting a European diplomat, said Xi was the winner of the visit, having, quote, cemented his image as the ruler of the world, where Westerners are begging him to solve Europe's problems in Ukraine. End quote. Now let's return to the theme of Beijing seeking to drive a wedge between Europe and the Americans. In a piece published this week, Charles Parton, a James Cook Associate Fellow in the Indo-Pacific Geopolitics at the UK-based Council on Geostrategy, with 22 years of diplomatic experience in Greater China, wrote, quote, "The main driver of the CCP's foreign relations is a fundamental anti-Americanism. Driving a wedge between the EU and the US is therefore a major aim. In this instant, adding a sideways dig in Serbia at NATO's expense is in line with the PRC's increasing complaints that the organization is interfering in Eastern Asia. The major issue upon which the CCP does not wish to see European unity is trade disputes. France has been supportive of the EU Commission's subsidy investigations into automotive, wind turbine and other areas, as well as into the PRC's procurement practices in medical devices. By contrast, Germany, worried about retaliation against its company's large investments in markets in the PRC, has played down the threat from the export to Europe of the PRC's overcapacity industries. She will want to blunt French support for the EU's Commission's measures. Divide and rule is a favoured policy of the CCP. While it pays lip service to the idea of a strong united Europe, the reality is that an EU in disarray better suits its interests, particularly trade and investment. And in Viktor Orban, Hungary's Prime Minister, the CCP has found a disruptive partner. A visit will aim to strengthen bonds and Orban's support for the PRC within the EU." End quote. We will cover the second leg of the Europe trip tomorrow. Next up, China's growing migrant labour forces issues and pension crisis. Hey everyone, just quickly, if you enjoyed today's episode, as always, it's a huge help if you can like and subscribe. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description below for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. It's a lot of work, but it's a true pleasure to be able to produce these open and free for everyone 6 days a week, and I hope with your support that I can continue doing so. Thank you so much, everybody. Next up, we move to the policy issues stemming from China's migrant labour force. A new report from the National Bureau of Statistics shows that more rural migrant workers are looking for jobs near their home, rather than working at factories in the Yangtze River Delta or Pearl River Delta regions. The reason, the report explains, is that the property sector's downturn has significantly reduced the number of migrant workers it needs in construction, and more rural workers are seeking jobs in the service sector in big cities. Last week, we saw how this influx of workers into the informal service sector is greatly depressing wages. According to the report, last year, among nearly 300 million migrant rural workers, about 40% worked near their home, while 60% left their hometown for employment, of which less than 40% went to another province. While the total number of migrant workers increased by 1.91 million in 2023, the number working in construction fell by 6.5 million from the previous year, the largest reduction in 5 years. Chinese financial media outlet Caixin explains that migrant workers are defined as those with rural household registration, known as hukou, engaging in non-agricultural work locally or working far away for at least 6 months of the year. The outlet adds that, quote, "the aging population of migrant workers is becoming significant." End quote. Indeed, in a long piece this week, UK-based Reuters explored this very issue of mass migrant worker aging. Approximately 100 million rural migrants are reaching retirement age in China over the next 10 years, and in rural areas, they will only enjoy a monthly pension of 123 yuan, $17 US. This is less than the World Bank's poverty threshold. The generation that flocked to China's cities at the end of the last century, building the infrastructure and manning the factories that made the country the world's biggest exporter, now risks a sharp, late-life drop in living standards, the outlet writes. Reuters interviewed more than a dozen people, including rural migrant workers, demographers, economists, and a government advisor, quote, who described a social security system unfit for a worsening demographic crisis. End quote. Yi Fuxian, a demographer who is also a senior scientist at University of Wisconsin-Madison, told the outlet, quote, the elderly in China will live a long and miserable life. More and more migrant workers are returning to the countryside, and some are taking low-paid jobs, which is a desperate way for them to save themselves. End quote. In China, 94 million working people were older than 60 in 2022, up from 8.8% in 2020. While lower than in wealthier Japan and South Korea, this rate is set to skyrocket as 300 million more Chinese reach their 60s in the coming decade. A third of this cohort are rural migrants, with little formal education and skills to move up the value chain. A government advisor told Reuters that the reason China has not built a stronger safety net for them is that policymakers, quote, fearing the economy might fall into the middle-income trap, end quote, prioritize growing the pie rather than sharing it. Quote, the irony is that Beijing refuses to shift from supply-side support to demand-side support because it fears falling into the middle-income trap. But it may well be the failure to make the shift that constitutes the trap. Other countries whose miracle growth period was driven by massive investment also saw growth rapidly peter out once their economies reached investment levels above which they could no longer absorb additional investment productivity. In that case, it requires rising demand to justify additional business investment, but rather than make the difficult institutional reforms needed to shift resources from investment to consumption, in almost every case, the country doubled down on investment. So far, that's never worked. After years in which the debt used to fund investment grew in line with GDP, the declining value of investment showed up in a surging debt-to-GDP ratio, and this usually went on until policymakers decided or were forced to rein in debt. Once that happened, the economy usually got caught up either in a sharp, brutal contraction or it stagnated in lost decades of slow growth. This was the middle-income trap that an increasing reliance on investment was supposed to prevent. The sooner China shifts towards consumption-driven growth, the sooner it will emerge from the trap. But the shift itself cannot help but be painful. That is why most countries historically have avoided it and instead doubled down on investment. End quote. Meanwhile, China's pension system is facing an emerging crisis. China's Academy of Social Sciences estimates that the pension system will run out of money by 2035, and it's already not very strong. Monthly urban pensions range from roughly 3,000 to 6,000 yuan, 400 to 800 US dollars, so this is not too bad. However, rural pensions, which were only introduced nationwide as late as 2009, are woefully inadequate. In March, China increased the minimum pension by 20 yuan to 123 yuan, $17 US per month. There is also a wide disparity in other resources. China's Academy of Social Sciences surveys show that the level of healthcare funding for urban workers was in some cases about 4 times higher than those with rural hukou. One option is for China to raise its retirement age. It's currently among the lowest in the world at 60 for men and 50 to 55 for women. But even significant changes, which would be politically difficult, here would be of limited effect. Traditionally, in Chinese culture, children looked after aging parents in rural parts of the country. However, of course, after decades of one-child policies, this is no longer a viable option either. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a good Thursday, and I will see you all tomorrow.